Welcome to my channel Brain Decoded. Today we're cutting straight to what most people think is character and showing you what it actually is, a trainable brain state. Today's title, Train Your Mind to Crush Procrastination in Hours. Imagine being able to take whatever nagging task has been haunting you, the report, the email, the workout, the phone call, and turn it from a looming mountain into a single declinable action you can start, finish, and feel genuinely better for. That's not motivation fairy dust. That's a sequence of state shifts you can produce reliably in hours, not months. Procrastination is often mislabeled as a personality flaw, a sign of weakness, or evidence that someone simply lacks discipline. But that framing misses the real mechanics at work. Procrastination is, at its core, a brain state problem. It emerges when certain neural circuits fall out of alignment, specifically when the systems responsible for emotional regulation, threat assessment, and long-term planning compete instead of collaborate. When you understand this, procrastination stops being a moral judgment and becomes something trainable, something you can work with, something you can shape. In the brain, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for planning, decision making, and impulse control. It's the part of the brain that says, this is important, this matters, do it now, but it has to contend with older, evolutionarily ancient circuits that operate on a much shorter time scale. Regions like the limbic system react to discomfort, stress, and uncertainty by turning up emotional load. When the limbic system pushes back with anxiety or avoidance signals, the prefrontal cortex has to work harder to maintain control. If the emotional load is high or the task feels overwhelming, the limbic system can win that tug-of war, and you experience that as hesitation, resistance, or delay. Not because you're lazy, but because the brain state required for initiation hasn't locked in yet. This dynamic gets even more interesting when we factor in dopamine, the neurotransmitter that governs motivation, drive, and the perceived value of rewards. Dopamine isn't just about feeling good. It's about assigning value to an action and predicting how rewarding that action will be. When dopamine is high for something immediately pleasurable, scrolling, eating, watching videos, and low for something that has delayed gratification, studying, writing, planning, the brain naturally shifts toward the option with the strongest dopamine signal. This isn't a character flaw, it's neuroeconomics. Your brain is constantly running cost-benefit calculations beneath your awareness. Procrastination is what happens when the cost side outweighs the benefit side in that subconscious equation. Another major factor is perceived threat. When a task feels uncertain, ambiguous, or too big, the amygdala, which plays a key role in threat detection, flags it as stressful. Even if the task isn't dangerous, the circuitry doesn't differentiate much between psychological discomfort and physical threat. Both can trigger avoidance. That resistance you feel towards starting the big project, sending the important email, or studying for a high-stakes exam is often the brain trying to protect you from discomfort. It's not rational, but it's predictable. Now, the flip side, the empowering part, is that brain states are not fixed. They are highly malleable and respond rapidly to shifts in behavior, environment, and internal cues. When you create even a small amount of clarity around a task, you reduce amygdala activation. When you take a tiny step forward, you create a dopamine pulse that begins to tip the cost-benefit equation. When you introduce structure, a timer, a clear starting point, a specific time window, you strengthen prefrontal control by reducing cognitive load. These are brain state interventions, not mindset tricks. One of the most powerful levers is reducing ambiguity. When a task is vague, work on the assignment, start the business, get healthier. The limbic system senses uncertainty and pushes back. But when you make the action concrete, write the first paragraph, outline 3 ideas, put on my running shoes, the brain no longer sees it as a threat. It becomes a known quantity, and known quantities are far easier for the prefrontal cortex to manage. This is why micro starts are so effective. They bypass the emotional resistance by making the first step almost frictionless. Another lever is state change through physiology. Your brain follows your body as much as your body follows your brain. Breathwork, posture shifts, even a brisk walk can change neurochemical balance, lowering stress signals and increasing readiness. When you adjust your physiology, you adjust your brain state, and that can make the difference between avoiding a task and stepping into it. Reward timing matters too. When you attach a small, predictable reward to completing a task, or even a small portion of the task, you create a new dopamine association. Over time, your brain begins to anticipate that reward and becomes more willing to engage. You can train your reward circuitry to value the process, not just the outcome. So procrastination isn't about laziness, and it's not about lacking willpower. It's a mismatch between the brain state you're in and the brain state required for the task you want to execute. When you shift your brain state by lowering ambiguity, adjusting physiology, using micro starts, structuring time, and aligning reward, you create the conditions for forward action. You don't wait for motivation. You generate the neural signals that make motivation more likely. Once you understand that procrastination is governed by circuitry, not character, you begin to see how trainable it is. You can shape the brain state that supports action, and once you can do that, procrastination becomes less of an identity and more of an outdated pattern you no longer need to obey. Starting tiny is one of the most powerful ways to bypass the friction that stops people from taking action, because it fundamentally changes the activation energy required for behavior. Activation energy, in a psychological and neurobiological sense, is the threshold level of effort, motivation, and neural engagement needed to begin an action. Most people overestimate that threshold, assuming they need a surge of motivation or a shift in mood before they can start. But the brain doesn't work that way. What it actually needs is a minimal entry point, something small enough that the circuits responsible for threat detection and energy conservation don't resist. When you reduce a task to its smallest executable unit, you shift the brain out of an avoidance state and into a mode of readiness. This happens because the limbic system, particularly structures like the amygdala, evaluates tasks based on perceived difficulty and potential discomfort. When a task seems big, vague, or time-consuming, the amygdala generates a mild stress response, elevated tension, hesitancy, a sense of not now. This is where people mistake stress for laziness, but when you shrink the task dramatically, the amygdala no longer interprets it as a threat. The emotional resistance drops. The brain essentially says, I can manage that. This is the psychological equivalent of warming up before a workout. You don't lift your heaviest weight or run at your fastest pace first. You ease your way in. The micro, start, or tiny step method is the warm-up for mental effort. It creates an opening for the prefrontal cortex to regain control and drive behavior forward. There's also a strong dopamine component to this. Dopamine increases when we move toward a goal, not just when we finish it. When you take even the smallest step, opening the document, writing one sentence, washing one dish, you trigger a small but meaningful pulse of dopamine. That pulse doesn't just feel good, it increases the probability that you'll continue the behavior. Dopamine reinforces direction. The direction doesn't need to be big, it just needs to be forward. Once the dopamine system senses progress, it begins recalibrating the task from something aversive to something rewarding. You've shifted the cost-benefit calculation in your favor. Another reason tiny starts are so effective is that they reduce cognitive load. When a task is large or complex, the brain has to juggle multiple layers of prediction. How long will this take? How hard will it be? Will I do it well? Will I fail? That prediction load activates stress circuitry. But when the first step is extremely small and clearly defined, the brain doesn't have to do that complex forecast. It just has to execute one action. Cognitive load drops and clarity increases. A clear task is a doable task. This ties into the concept of behavioral gating. Behavior change doesn't require you to overhaul your entire state. It requires you to get through the gate of initiation. Tiny actions lower the gate so much that stepping through becomes almost automatic. For example, if your goal is to study for 2 hours, sitting down and opening the book might be your tiny start. If your goal is to exercise, putting on your workout clothes might be the start. These small actions don't accomplish the entire task, but they shift your brain into the behavioral mode required for the larger action. One of the more underestimated aspects of tiny starts is how they create a feedback loop of identity. When you take small actions consistently, the brain begins updating its model of who you are: someone who starts quickly, someone who doesn't avoid, someone who moves into action even when the task isn't appealing. Identity is built through repeated action, not through declarations. Each tiny start is a micro. Vote for the kind of person you are trying to become. There's also the physics analogy, which is surprisingly relevant. Objects at rest require more force to start moving than objects already in motion. Your brain behaves similarly. The first movement, no matter how small, reduces the energetic barrier for continued movement. Once you're in motion, momentum works in your favor. That's why starting tiny often leads to doing far more than you expected. You might intend to read for 2 minutes and end up going for 20. You might commit to writing 1 sentence and end up finishing a page. But even if you don't continue, the system still benefits because you've reinforced the initiation circuitry. Another key component is expectation management. When the brain anticipates a big task, it often postpones it because the emotional cost feels too high. But tiny starts send a different message. We're not doing the whole thing, we're just doing this one small part. This updates the internal narrative and reduces psychological pressure. And once psychological pressure drops, the brain becomes more efficient. Stress constricts attention, reduced stress widens it. The beauty of tiny starts is that they are universally applicable. Whether you're trying to learn a skill, build a business, study, get healthier, or declutter your environment, the principle remains the same: shrink the entry point so low that action becomes almost inevitable. Once the brain experiences a small win, it becomes more receptive to larger wins. Progress compounds, confidence grows, and over time, the activation energy required for bigger tasks naturally drops. So starting tiny isn't a hack or a motivational trick. It's a neurobiologically grounded strategy that respects how the brain processes effort, threat, and reward. When you master this, you gain a reliable way to shift from avoidance to action, regardless of mood or motivation. You're training your brain to begin, and beginning is often the only thing that separates people who make progress from those who stay stuck. Deciding your actions through implementation intentions is one of the most reliable ways to override procrastination because it removes the moment of decision where most people stumble. At the neural level, procrastination lives in that tiny gap between "I should do this" and "I'm going to start now." That gap is where the limbic system pulls you toward comfort, distraction, or delay. Implementation intentions essentially close that gap. They pre-wire the behavior so the brain doesn't have to negotiate in real time, which is precisely where things usually fall apart. Implementation intentions follow a simple structure: if X happens, then I will do Y. It sounds straightforward, but what's happening under the surface is profound. You are assigning a specific cue to a specific action, creating a predictable neural mapping. The brain loves predictability because it reduces the demand on executive function. When the cue appears, there's no debate, no emotional tug-of, or no internal negotiation. The action becomes automatic, or at least far easier to initiate. Think about what normally happens without implementation intentions. You tell yourself you'll study later, or you'll get to the gym, or you'll start that project today. But later is vague. Today is vague. The brain doesn't respond well to vagueness because vague goals require constant reconsideration. Every time you need to reconsider, you expend cognitive and emotional energy. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and long-term goals, has to wrestle with the limbic system, which wants comfort and minimal effort. Over time, the limbic system usually wins, not because it's stronger, but because it has the advantage of immediacy. It offers short-term relief, while the prefrontal cortex is offering long-term benefit. Humans are wired to favor the immediate unless systems are put in place to shift that balance. Implementation intentions act as those systems. When you decide ahead of time, if it's 9:00 a.m., then I sit at my desk and write for 15 minutes. You remove the limbic system's leverage. There is no question of mood, motivation, or how you feel in that moment. The brain sees the cue 9:00 a.m. and the action follows, you've built a reflex around discipline rather than leaving discipline up to willpower. There's also a strong neural efficiency component to this. When you use implementation intentions consistently, the brain forms deeper associations between cue and action. Over time, this shifts the behavior from the prefrontal cortex, effortful, deliberate action, into the basal ganglia, automatic routines and habits. This is exactly how habits are formed, repetition in response to a stable cue. So implementation intentions not only help you overcome procrastination in the short term, they help automate your behavior in the long term. Another key element is that implementation intentions reduce cognitive load. When you're overwhelmed by a task, part of that overwhelm comes from having to decide when, where, and how to start. Those decisions drain mental energy. But when the plan is pre-decided, you eliminate those choices. The brain performs significantly better when the number of decisions is reduced. This is why people with strong routines appear highly disciplined. They're not making dozens of micro decisions. They're simply following pre-decided actions. The effectiveness of implementation intentions also comes from their precision. Vague intentions don't work. The cue has to be specific enough that the brain recognizes it instantly. If I feel motivated is not a cue. If it's 7:30 p.m. is. If I get home and put down my bag is. If I finish lunch and close the kitchen cabinet is. Precision triggers reliability. Deciding also affects emotional resistance. Most avoidance is emotional, not logical. But when the action is tied to a cue, the emotional brain has less room to interfere. You're not evaluating how you feel about doing the task. You're responding to the cue. This bypasses the emotional bottleneck that often leads to procrastination. Another reason implementation intentions work so well is that they generate a small sense of commitment and accountability. When you craft a clear plan, if it's 6 p.m., then I will go for a 20-minute walk, you create a psychological contract with yourself. The clearer the contract, the higher the likelihood you'll keep it. Humans are wired to avoid breaking commitments, even internal ones, when those commitments are explicit and actionable. There's also a momentum effect. Once you follow an implementation intention even once, the brain receives a signal that this is a reliable pattern. That small success reinforces the circuitry involved in initiating action, making future initiation easier. It builds competence and confidence simultaneously. What makes pre-deciding so powerful is that it respects the realities of how the brain actually works. It acknowledges that motivation fluctuates, that stress interferes with decision making, and that the brain defaults to comfort when the path isn't clearly defined. Implementation intentions eliminate ambiguity and pre-align your neural pathways with the behaviors you want to produce. So the real value here isn't just in planning. It's in training your brain to respond to cues with action. Over time, this makes discipline feel less like effort and more like a natural extension of your daily rhythm. When your actions are pre-decided, procrastination loses its place in the system because the system no longer asks whether you should start, it simply starts. Using structured time paired with a deliberate reward architecture is one of the most reliable ways to convert intention into consistent action because it creates a predictable rhythm in the brain. What often keeps people stuck in cycles of procrastination isn't a lack of desire to work, it's the absence of structure. When time is unstructured, the brain interprets it as limitless, and limitless time actually decreases urgency. Without urgency, the limbic system dominates, pulling attention toward whatever is easiest, most familiar, or most immediately rewarding. Structure reverses that dynamic. It creates a boundary, and boundaries generate focus. When you segment time, whether into 25-minute work intervals or 45-minute deep focus blocks, you are essentially shaping the brain's relationship to effort. The brain is far more willing to engage deeply for a short, defined period than for an undefined stretch of time. A 25-minute interval feels manageable. The prefrontal cortex sees it as a feasible unit of effort, but when the task is framed as work until this is finished, the brain perceives it as open-ended, uncertain, and cognitively heavy. Uncertainty increases stress, and stress increases avoidance. Structure dissolves that uncertainty by giving the brain a clear start point and a predictable end point. This is where the Pomodoro-style approach works so effectively. Set a timer for a specific interval and commit to working only during that interval. You don't have to finish the entire project. You just have to show up fully within that block of time. When the timer ends, you step away. That stepping away is crucial. It teaches the brain that the effort period is temporary, which reduces resistance in future sessions. Over time, the brain associates structured blocks with manageable effort rather than overwhelming demand. Pairing this with reward architecture makes the system dramatically more powerful. Motivation is not a constant. It fluctuates based on dopamine levels, perceived effort, and predicted reward. You can influence this by deliberately stacking rewarding stimuli immediately after completing a work interval. This could be something small, a short walk, a favorite snack, 2 minutes of stretching, checking messages, or listening to music you enjoy. The key is to make the reward contingent on completing the interval. That contingency is how the brain learns. Each time you finish a focused block and receive a reward, dopamine reinforces the behavior. Not because the task itself was thrilling, but because the sequence, work, then reward, creates an association. The brain starts predicting that effort will be followed by something enjoyable. Over repeated cycles, the brain begins to anticipate that reward during the work itself, which increases motivation to start the next block. You're teaching your brain to look forward to effort. There's another mechanism at play here. Structured time introduces cycles of high focus followed by deliberate disengagement. These cycles are beneficial because the brain can only maintain intense focus for so long before neural fatigue sets in. Short breaks prevent the buildup of cognitive residue, those lingering thoughts that make it harder to transition between tasks. By stopping at the end of a time block, you're not only preserving mental energy, you're training the brain to respect the boundaries you set. Reward architecture also helps counteract the pull of digital distractions. The modern environment is saturated with high dopamine stimuli videos, social media, notifications, each competing for your attention. When you intentionally place these stimuli in the reward category rather than the default background, you reduce their power to interrupt your work. You're not denying yourself pleasure, you're reorganizing when and how pleasure is accessed. That reorganization shifts your dopamine landscape, making focused work more sustainable. Another important piece is that structured time creates measurable progress. When you complete 3 or 4 blocks in a day, you have tangible evidence of the work you've done. The brain loves measurable progress. It creates a sense of momentum. Momentum increases self-belief, and self-belief reduces internal friction. As friction decreases, initiation becomes easier. Reward architecture also taps into the fundamental principle of operant conditioning. Behavior followed by reward increases in frequency, but the reward has to be immediate. Humans respond poorly to rewards that arrive too far into the future. That's why long-term goals alone rarely motivate consistent action. The brain needs something sooner, something predictable, something tied to the present effort. A 5-minute enjoyable break can accomplish more for habit formation than a vague promise of long-term success. What makes this combination so impactful is that it aligns your behavior with your biology. The brain is designed to work in pulses of effort, not endless marathons. It's designed to respond to reward, not rely on willpower alone. When you respect those constraints and build your system around them, procrastination loses much of its power. Structured time gives your brain clarity. Reward architecture gives your brain incentive. Together, they create a sustainable loop. Begin, focus, complete, reward, reset. Repeat this loop enough times, and action becomes the default. You don't rely on motivation anymore. You rely on a system that consistently guides your brain toward the behaviors you want. If you try one thing today, make it the micro start. 2 minutes of imperfect action will give you information, momentum, and a feed of small wins that the brain loves. Don't wait for motivation to arrive. Build the conditions where your brain is forced to choose action over avoidance. If this helped you, do one simple thing right now. Pick a task and type in the comments what your 2-minute micro start will be. I'll read a few and pin the ones that show the cleanest implementation, intentions, accountability, speeds change. Train your mind like you train a muscle. Short, consistent stresses, clear cues, and immediate, predictable rewards. Do this for hours, and the habit takes hours, not years. This is Brain Decoded. If you found value, like, subscribe, and share with someone who's convinced they'll fix procrastination tomorrow. Start now.